to the video lecture where we'll be discussing the topic of curriculum. This lecture will review the two readings assigned. One by Michael Apple called The Politics of Official Knowledge, Does a National Curriculum Make Sense? And the other, Caring for Ideas by Nell Noddings. Before we get into the lecture, let's talk about what we'll be discussing. The overarching question for today's lecture is what should be included in the school curriculum? As always, these questions have sub-questions, things that we must answer in order to fully answer the overarching question. These sub-questions include, well, if there is a school curriculum, then who should decide what that curriculum is? And in that curriculum, what are the things that we're considering knowledge, that facts that students must know? And what skills are we thinking that are important that we must make sure that the curriculum develops? Then, once we have that curriculum, how should we teach it? And how should we assess students and teachers and evaluate them on how well they are meeting the curriculum standards? All of these questions, sub-questions, ultimately will be influenced by this other sub-question, which is what is the overarching goal of education? That is, if we think the goal of education is to prepare students for college, then we might choose to have a particular type of curriculum that has particular facts and skills that are developed, and that we would teach and assess students in a way that would help promote our overarching goal of getting students into college. As you listen to this video lecture, think about how the different authors, as well as how you would answer these questions. What do you think should be included in the curriculum? And how should we teach and evaluate it? Let's first discuss a little bit about who the authors are for this week. The first author is Michael Apple. Michael Apple is a recent retired professor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is a notable educational theorist who specialized in the idea of power, politics, and curriculum within education. So it makes sense that we're reading him for this topic of curriculum. Before becoming a professor of education, Michael Apple served as an elementary and also secondary school teacher in the state of New Jersey. He also studied in New York City at Teachers College, where he got his PhD. The article that we read this week by Michael Apple, The Politics of Official Knowledge, was originally presented as a lecture at the American Association of Educational Research in 1992, and from that he published this article in 1993. We've already reviewed who Nell Noddings was, and the class focused on teaching and learning. When we read Nell Noddings' article, Is Teaching a Practice? Please see this video lecture if you would like to review who she was as a person. Let's discuss what Michael Apple means by a politic of knowledge, as this idea influences how he discusses and conceives of the problems of a national curriculum and why he proposes a different approach. Essentially, Michael Apple is making the argument that what we include in a curriculum, the knowledge that we consider correct and worthwhile to be teaching to students, can never be neutral. We have to select what is included and what is excluded in the curriculum, and by doing so, we reflect our particular biases, most notably the biases of the people in power that decide what the curriculum looks like in the first place. Beyond just what the curriculum is, in terms of the content, curriculum can also mean how we teach the curriculum, the method, as well as how we assess the curriculum. Here, Michael Apple is saying that there is essentially a hidden curriculum. We can remember this concept from Ivan Illich, this underlying message that promotes a particular view of the world, a particular way of understanding the world, through what is taught, how it's taught, and how it's assessed. Think about how you may have learned something that may not be factually true in your schooling experience, or how a particular test seemed to privilege particular types of students, or even how particular teaching methods seem to empower or disempower particular students, or ways of knowing or ways of learning. These are things that Michael Apple calls the politics of official knowledge having a play in the educational environment, that is, through the lens of the curriculum. Essentially, he's saying here that the curriculum is written by those who are in power, just like history is often written by the victors. And as such, the curriculum is always short-sighted. It promotes a particular view, and this view might disempower or disenfranchise particular types of students or different ways of being in the world. And this creates problems in terms of power dynamics. Here we can see that Michael Apple is connecting to this idea of power in education that is brought up by Freire that we learned about in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We can also think of Michael Apple's idea of the politics of knowledge as we do when thinking about how we interpret a particular experience different than others interpret it, or how we might interpret a particular text different than others. In this way, we can see how we interpret the world reflects our own understanding of the world, as well as our past experiences, our current lived realities, and the values that you hold. We can genuinely say that you may interpret a particular situation or text different than how I might interpret that particular text or situation. And this is where curriculum becomes problematic. Who is to say that my interpretation of what happened is correct or more correct or more right than yours? Here there has to be some choice. And in that making of that choice, someone is exercising power by legitimizing a particular interpretation over somebody else's interpretation. This is essentially the politics of knowledge within the curriculum. Whose voice, whose perspectives, and whose values are at play and being represented? Let's look a little more closely at what this means within the three areas of the curriculum that Michael Apple focuses on. In terms of the politics of knowledge within selecting the content that will be included in the curriculum, Michael Apple discusses how those in power determine what is included. Think about not only what facts or subjects are emphasized, but also what skills are included and encouraged and developed through the curriculum. Here Michael Apple is saying that those in power determine what is considered correct and worthwhile, and as a result, send messages to both students and teachers about which ways of knowing, which facts, and which skills are not important in society and therefore not worthy of the time or focus in school. Here is a reason for why Michael Apple thinks the national curriculum is dangerous. That is, because the curriculum inevitably reflects a particular view of the world, it serves to empower some groups and disempowering other groups. Can you think of a time where a particular skill or a particular subject or particular topic was taught that you thought was not important? You didn't understand why you were learning it? Perhaps it's because your perspective of the world, your lived reality and needs were different than those who determined that it was necessary for you to learn this concept to begin with. Have you ever had the experience where you were sitting in a class and a teacher or a textbook stated something to be true that you did not think was true, or that you thought clashed with your lived reality? Here again is a reflection of the politics of knowledge at play, where one person or a group of people's perspective of the world is presented as the one and only way, when in fact your way may be just as equally as valid. So if we think of the politics of knowledge within teaching methods, this looks like how a teacher might be expected to teach in order to meet all students. The expectation that all teachers teach this particular way reflects one person or one group's particular view on what is the right way to teach. And this approach may leave out other ways of teaching that meet different types of students. Essentially, Apple says that these expectations of the best way to teach that exercise the power of some over others ultimately create resistance and renew the divisions between teachers and students as well as teachers themselves. That is, if I am a teacher who believes that I have the best method of teaching and I teach this way to my students and I'm not willing to change based on my students' responses to my teaching, my students may resist my methods. Additionally, if I'm a teacher who doesn't agree with the standards for how to teach a particular subject or particular idea, and I think that method is wrong and I prefer to use another method, if I'm not allowed to do so, that's going to create resistance between me and my superiors because I'm not allowed to teach in the way that I think is best for the students in my particular context. Later we'll see how this translates into a critique that Apple has of the national curriculum. Furthermore, this idea of the politics of knowledge within teaching methods often suggests a particular enforcement of one way of teaching, and the idea that if we unify how teachers teach, then all people and all students will experience and gain the same things from learning. But Michael Apples explains how equal treatment does not always allow for fair treatment. That means equality is not the same as equity. If I treat you the same as I treat someone else, but you have different needs than someone else, then I might not end up giving you fair treatment. Usually, within a national curriculum, there's expectations on how we should teach. That should be the same regardless of the students and the teachers. Apple thinks this is problematic, as it's promoting a particular view of the best way to teach and the best way to learn. Instead, he argues that the methods that teacher uses should account for the differences in their students and the context in which they're teaching. That is, my teaching methods need to be responsive to the social realities of my students and myself, of the cultures that they represent, and the power dynamics that exist within the society and community around me, as well as in the school itself. The politics of knowledge also can be shown in how we evaluate students and teachers, that is, curriculum assessment. If we think that there's a particular subject that we need to teach that includes particular facts that must be taught, we then create an assessment on how well those facts are understood by our students. The problem here is, for Apple, that these facts represent only one group's perspective and often delegitimizes how other groups understand the topic or learn the topic. And therefore, the tests only measure how well a particular student or teacher fits within the box that's created by those in power, and says that if you do pass this test, then you are smart, you are a professional, you are a good teacher. And if you do not pass these tests, you are stupid or you are not a good teacher. When in fact, Apple would say that that might not necessarily be the case. It's that you are not a good teacher in the eyes of the people who hold these particular values and perspectives in lives, but does not mean that you are not a good teacher overall. Similarly, just because you as a student don't perform on a particular test that says this is a particular way of knowing something or understanding something or a particular fact does not mean that you do not know anything or that your understanding of the material is incorrect. It is just different, namely because it is not the one that's considered officially correct. Here, Apple questions what counts as knowledge and how can we assess it. Think about our test-taking experiences and the frustrations we've had of the test not adequately representing how we understood a particular topic. In this way, the test may be biased by asking you to demonstrate your understanding in a way that privileges a different way of knowing than the one that you have, or because it emphasizes facts or knowledge that you disagree with as actually being factual. Additionally, Apple discusses how the politics of knowledge influences curriculum assessment by allowing different accesses to and resources to perpetuate the stigmatization and ranking of students based on their test scores. We can think here of the author Ivan Illich and his idea of the problems around schools as being a way of ranking and classifying students by age. Here they are Apple's talking about ranking them based on measured ability. Essentially, Apple is saying that because we know that there are differences in how students have access to quality teachers and quality resources, as well as the different lived realities that students face that might place them at disadvantages, that these things are highlighted through curriculum assessments, because these assessments don't take into account these differences in how students are able to show up for class, to understand the material, and then perform well on tests. In this way, assessing students based on curriculum, as well as assessing teachers based on how well their students perform on these curriculum tests, Apple thinks as a leading cause of exacerbating current inequalities within society. We can think about many examples today, but notably in thinking about the entrance exams and additional specialized tests that students take in New York City to place into specialized high schools, where the majority of students accepted are white students, and very few students of color, African American and Latino students, are accepted, represent a problem in curriculum assessment. It's assessing a particular way of understanding the world, as well as assessing how well a student has been able to understand particular material, which may not have been material that they learned because of where they went to school or who they had as teachers. Here, Apple sees this as problematic. In fact, just recently, a report was released about the New York City school additional placement exams for specialized high schools that said about only 10% of students of color were admitted into these schools this year, although students of color represent 70% of all students in New York City public schools. This is an example of how curriculum assessment privileges particular people and particular power systems and serves to further disenfranchise and disempower other groups. So let's look at some real-life examples of how the politics of official knowledge play out. These three examples come from Texas. First, we're going to look at an example of a textbook that identified African American slaves as immigrants and workers while using particular language to talk about white immigrants. Then we'll look at an example in a history textbook where slavery was downplayed as not being all that bad, and the accompanying worksheet that students were asked to do to reflect this particular view of slavery. And lastly, we'll look at a textbook that was rejected because it promoted a debatable and controversial view of evolution in a science textbook.
Burin shared this cell phone video on social media.
This is a part of the Texas textbook adoption.
After her son Kobe texted her about an alarming passage in his textbook
about Africans coming over as workers.
Kobe sent her this image, which reads,
"The Atlantic slave trade between the 1500s and the 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations."
That map is under a section heading called Patterns of Immigration.
Immigrants. immigrants. Yeah, that word matters.
In the next section, the text mentions English and European people,
Many of whom came as indentured servants to work for little or no pay. So they say that about English and European people, but there is no mention of Africans working as slaves or being slaves. It just says we were workers.
Dean Byrne contacted the publisher, McGraw-Hill, to express her concerns. The company responded on Facebook, saying in part, "We conducted a close review of the content and agree that our language in that caption did not adequately convey that Africans were both forced into migration and to labor against their will as slaves. We believe we can do better." The company has agreed to change the digital version of the book immediately and will correct the text in the next printing of this particular book. Dean Byrne was thrilled to get such a quick response from McGraw-Hill, posting on social media, "This is change, people. This is why your voices matter." She encourages other students and parents to speak up.
Now let's look at a different textbook that talks about the history of the United States in the topic of slavery. Here it says, quote, "But the peculiar institutions, as Southerns came to call it," they're referring here to slavery, "like all human institutions, should not be oversimplified. While there are cruel masters who maimed or even killed their slaves, although killing and maiming were against the law in every state, there were also kind and generous owners. The institution was complex as the people involved. Though most slaves were whipped at some point in their lives, a few never felt the lash. Nor did all slaves work in the fields. Some were house servants or skilled artisans. Many may not have even been terribly unhappy with their lot, for they knew no other." So here you can see how the politics of official knowledge, similarly at play in the video example, reflects a particular view of slavery that might be skewed as being very whitewashed, or perhaps American loyalist, or perhaps a historical denier, or perhaps even racist. Here the language in this passage suggests a justification that slavery was not as bad as we have made it out to be. You can see this in the parentheses, although killing and maiming were against the law, so like, some people were cruel, but, we didn't allow for it legally by somehow justifying or making it less bad. And then the emphasis on the benefits of slavery, downplaying its negative and significant harms that it did to African Americans and Africans. That is, not all slave owners were bad. Some of them were kind. And not all slaves were punished. And in fact, some slaves might have been very happy. Here the language seems to be promoting a particular view of slavery. One which I would personally call a racist view of slavery. Accompanying this assignment was a worksheet that students were asked to do that exacerbates this idea of a particular viewpoint. Here the worksheet says, "The life of slaves, a balanced view. What might be some positive aspects of slave life for slaves themselves, and what are some negative aspects?" Here you can see the student sees it's problematic and says there were no positive aspects for slaves, they were all negative. But the worksheet itself is trying to encourage a particular view that's more balanced than the one that evolution is true. So now let's look at what a national curriculum means and what are some benefits of it. So Michael Apple thinks that, a national curriculum is problematic because of this idea of the hidden curriculum, which is essentially that particular perspectives, those of the ones in power, infiltrate the curriculum and promote a particular way of seeing and understanding the world, which is problematic. But not all people think that this is true, and not all people reject the idea of a nationalized curriculum. There are 4 general arguments for why a national curriculum might be beneficial and necessary in the United States. The first one is that a national curriculum will help raise the standards for everyone. So it might eliminate the ability for Texas to have particular standards in their textbooks as well as standards in terms of graduation requirements or subject understanding or comprehension, and therefore level the playing field for all students in the United States. And this will in turn improve education for all students, as it will ensure that all students receive the same material at the same type of quality. Related to this, a national curriculum will help ensure that schools and teachers are held accountable for teaching the subjects and the skills and the content in a particular way that ensures that students are learning correctly. This would allow assessments to be universal and uniform across all states and schools so that we can see how schools and districts and states are doing in terms of meeting these new standards. In this case, people who believe in the national curriculum think that this is a good thing, as it will help bring up all schools to the level of excellence. Additionally, a national curriculum is argued as being one that helps Americans in the U.S. become more competitive in the international arena. So globally, other countries have national curriculum, and they're doing better on standardized tests than our students in the United States. So the argument goes that if it works for other countries, it should work for us, and it also will help us be more competitive globally. Here we can see this idea of global competitiveness as connecting to the ideas discussed by Martha Nussbaum for why there's an emphasis on STEM education recently, that we must focus on STEM because that's what will allow us to be more globally competitive. But remember, Martha Nussbaum did not agree with this. She did not think that this was the best way to go. And lastly, an argument for the national curriculum is that by making sure that all students learn a particular view and particular values within the curriculum, that we help maintain an American identity. This idea that we are all share particular values and understanding of our history. That without such a curriculum, American identity might be fractured or disappear altogether. Can you think of some additional reasons for why someone might think a national curriculum is good? Let's look at an example. So recently in the United States, there was a push for the Common Core state standards, which was a standard for academic performance, an assessment protocol that should be applied to all students in all states. This is different than a prescribed curriculum in a sense of content. So it wasn't that you had to use a particular book or teach a particular subject, but that instead students must all be able to demonstrate a particular academic performance in the different subjects. So all students must understand the origins of slavery in the United States, but how they get to understanding that would be up to the students and teachers in the states. So here the Common Core was pushed as a way of helping to address the concerns that not all students were performing well across all states, and as well as to help make sure that the U.S. was remaining competitive in the global market. The Common Core benchmarks were also supposed to help allow teachers and states to have some freedom in how they taught the subjects, because it did not prescribe particular curriculum content, but instead different required assessment benchmarks. Currently, today, the Common Core has been adopted by 35 states. At one point in time, it wasn't, the idea was that we were going to adopt it in all states. But there has been some pushback, and therefore not all states have adopted the Common Core policies. So 35 states, those in greenish blue, have. 11 states have decided that they're not going to use the Common Core. They're going to replace it or completely rewrite it, majorly rewrite it. 4 states, including Texas, never adopted the Common Core to begin with. And 1 state has adopted the Common Core, but only in the particular subject area of English and language arts. So let's look at the arguments for why people thought the Common Core was a good idea. And again, the Common Core is a model of a particular way of having a nationalized curriculum in terms of having a nationalized assessment benchmark policy. Advocates argued that the Common Core would help create consistency. So this idea that if every state had a universal standard, that we would have the same expectations of all students. This would lead to equity. So these standards can make sure that all students have the ability to an excellent education and that all students get the same education. This is also true in terms of competitiveness. So by having a Common Core state standard, all students will be prepared to compete on equal footing with their peers and with those around the world, and this becomes important in job placement, but also in getting into college, right? That we all start from the same place, so the competition is fair. The idea is that the Common Core state standards would also provide clarity in helping students and teachers and parents in schools understand what was expected of them when they went to school, when they were teaching, when they were learning something. So this idea of being able to know what your goals are to help you understand the process that you're learning or teaching. And the Common Core state standards, as being a benchmark national curriculum, was supposed to help encourage collaboration. So because they would be applied to all states, it would allow states to collaborate with one another on best practices or particular curriculum models that they developed that aligned with the Common Core state standards. It would also allow districts within one state to work and collaborate Welcome to the video with lecture one another, where we'll be discussing the topic of teachers. curriculum. Let's consider a little bit more about why a national curriculum might be problematic. And these are challenges that Michael Apple raises in his article that we read. One is the issue of politics of knowledge, that the curriculum is going to reflect one particular value and perspective of those in power. Do you believe this? Do you think it's possible that the curriculum could be inclusive enough so that it does not have a problem with the politics of knowledge? That multiple values and perspectives could be possible within a curriculum, and therefore this critique wouldn't hold? Related to this, Apple says that because the curriculum will be created by those in power, it's going to inevitably exclude certain ways of knowing. So, in assessing you, you have to show me that you know something in this particular way by performing well in this bubble test, by doing this mathematical equation in this structure. He thinks that this is problematic because it is exclusionary and disempowering. This relates to how overall the curriculum will increase inequality. So it will disadvantage those that are left out, those who are not in power, that did not decide or do not align with the curriculum in terms of its views and its perspectives. Those students and teachers will be left out, will be struggling, will not see themselves represented, and this will therefore influence teacher quality and student interest as well as performance. Fourth, that the national curriculum will create particular ways of excluding and including particular groups as being successful or not on the different assessments related to the curriculum, therefore privileging those in power generally over those who are not in power. Fifth, that a national curriculum aims for providing a universal umbrella curriculum, but he thinks that this is impossible because essentially how you interpret the world influences how you understand the curriculum. So since my context, my history, my values impact how I interact with the curriculum, it's not possible for the curriculum to ever be uniform or nationalized. That even if you had the same textbook in all schools, different people, different teachers, different students will learn and take away different things from that same textbook. And lastly, he points to this concern of national curriculum as helping serve capitalistic purposes. That is, by creating a national curriculum, you then create a need for a new textbook that will then benefit a particular company that will sell and generate those textbooks, that creates an industry of training teachers on this new textbook, on promoting particular companies who evaluate and assess understanding of the material so that it feeds this idea of capitalism by making certain people wealthier. And he says it's usually those who are in power and helping decide what the curriculum is in the first place. So instead, Michael Apple suggests that instead of a national curriculum, perhaps there needs to be a community-focused curriculum. That is, one that's generated by the community. But what that means can look differently based on how you understand community-focused curriculum. One is that a community-focused curriculum can be a curriculum developed at the local level, where the community members, including the schools and the teachers, but also the parents and the business workers and the politicians in that local community, determine what should be taught in the schools within their community. That's one option. The second option is that a community-controlled curriculum is a community at the state level, where what is taught in the schools is regulated by the state. So all schools and communities within the state follow the same curriculum, but the state might not be the same as other states. This is a model that currently exists in many states today. And then there's the third model, which is school choice. This idea that each school can determine its own curriculum. So even within the same community, different elementary schools may have different curriculums depending on what the school decides to use. So let's look at what is actually happening in the United States in terms of textbook policies and curriculum policies. So currently, there are 30 states that allow the local level, the communities, to determine what curriculum and textbooks should be taught, while there are 20 states that the curriculum is mandated at the state level, that the state level decides, and then all the schools in the state follow this. So, for example, at the state level, we do have Texas, but we also have Nevada and Mississippi and Louisiana and Kentucky and Idaho. At the local level, we have states like New York and New Jersey, where the local districts get to determine what textbooks to adopt. We're going to have an optional journal assignment where you can look at some of these policies for textbook adoptions more in depth. Because just because a state has a policy of selecting a textbook for all schools in the state, it does not mean that that policy looks the same in each state, and similarly at the local level. So, for example, it might be in one state that one textbook is selected for all schools in that state. In other states, it might be that there's a list of 10 textbooks that are allowed at the state. It also might mean that the people in the state that are deciding this differ based on the state. So in some states, it's a combination of educators and superintendents. In other states, it's all the people that are elected political officials. And you can think about who decides what textbooks are allowed based on their background and how they became powerful can influence greatly the type of curriculum they might be inclined to pick.